Hello, and welcome to your next video, video number 4. Today we're going to be talking about some more writerly concerns. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the terms tone, diction, audience, point of view, and metadiscourse. Now, I've already asked you to think about these questions as you're reading, but today we're just going to go into them with a little bit more depth so that we're really familiar as we continue discussing readings and your writing as the semester continues. Now, when you're thinking about audience, you're not just thinking about a person, right? We can't just say mom, or we can't just say myself, like when you're writing in a journal. When you're thinking about audience, you're thinking about a bunch of different circumstances coming together. And you're also thinking not only about a literal audience, but an imaginary audience, right? Where our writing might very well go beyond the audience that we imagine it for. So some questions you can ask yourself as you're writing are, who are you talking to? What is the purpose of your writing? Because obviously the purpose is going to change the way you're talking to that audience. Is it going to be a potential employer? Is it your best friend, your grandma? Who might read your writing? So again, this has to do with production beyond just the audience that you're imagining. What is this relationship? How can you use that relationship to your advantage? Or what in that relationship might keep the audience at an arm's length? And finally, where and when will this be read? Is this something that somebody 10,000 years from now is going to find and wonder, oh, is this what people were like? Knowing who your audience is, when they are, and where they are is going to let you know what kind of information you need to give in order for your information to make sense.
What is an Instagram?
Though it might be difficult in the context of this class, please remember, we are only part of your audience. Do not write just for us, especially because we're thinking about community. I want you to think about where this writing could go within the community itself. So once you've decided on that, you'll have a much better sense of a couple of things. First, diction and tone. Diction is about the kind of words you choose, and tone has to do with the way those words are read and characterize your writerly voice. So for example, the difference between saying something is silly versus saying something is flippant. So choosing silly or flippant is going to depend on what you think the audience knows. Are they going to know the word flippant? It also is going to depend on whether you want a more elevated tone or you want something that's a little bit more colloquial. Syntax has to do with how sentences are put together. So a good example of how we can think about syntax might be in like Shakespeare, for example, inverting the verb. So walked the man down the street. It sounds a little bit more old-timey than the man walked down the street. However, it can be used to good effect. Finally, though not to be imagined as these are the only things, but we have devices. So devices are things that are related to how we shape that language. So again, this might have to do with syntax, it might have to do with diction and tone, but the thing that you're probably most familiar with would be something like metaphor or simile. And these can introduce people to common ideas. Idioms would be something like early to bed, early to rise, something like that. However, remember that some things, especially colloquialisms and idioms, are going to be culturally specific. For example, in English, if it's raining really hard, we would say something like, it's raining cats and dogs. However, in French, the words actually translate to, it's raining chords. So that wouldn't actually work if you imagined a French-speaking audience. A few little more notes about rhetorical devices. So devices can be thought of as being functional, or they can be thought of as being aesthetic, things that beautify or something like that. Obviously, the best device is going to be one that is both beautiful or interesting as well as functional. And it needs to be appropriate to what's going on. So for example, if you're trying to be very serious, then something like rhyming, right, would not maybe be the most appropriate thing for talking about a serious subject. There are hundreds of devices that have been identified and developed, and in English, a lot of that actually comes from speeches in Greek and Roman era. So feel free to look at devices to see if there's something interesting you can use. Some of them don't make quite as much sense in English, but they can be a really useful tool for giving your writing an interesting kind of color and tone. Now, we've already talked a little bit about point of view in terms of pronouns. So there's 3 points of view, first, second, and third, and there's singular point of view and plural point of view. So for example, first person singular would be I, first person plural would be we. The only one where you would use the same pronoun is second person. Second person singular and plural, you would always use you. Now, if we're talking with this I, right, that's going to be showing the reader that, oh, this person is talking from a very personal experience. If we're saying we, you're assuming that the audience somehow connects with you. Third person, excuse me, can sometimes sound a little bit accusatory, right? Or it can be omniscient, right? Often we read novels that said that she, the character, did this. And so that gives a sense of observer status. It's sort of unusual to use the second person. It's not unheard of, but it can be really unusual. And we'll actually be reading an essay later this semester that uses you. You, again, can sound sort of accusatory, right? As more accusatory than something like they, which separates out an audience, right? But you can sound accusatory, and you draws the reader in particular kinds of ways and can be a really strong choice. The last thing we need to talk about is metadiscourse, which sounds a lot scarier than it actually is. So let's get started. First question we need to answer is, what is metadiscourse? Well, if we separate the term into its constituent parts, we have meta, and meta comes from the Greek word for after, and it's actually taken from writings by Aristotle called the Metaphysica, and literally when Aristotle used it, he just meant that it was the chapter after the chapter on physics. Today, however, meta refers to something that is called self-referential, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Discourse, on the other hand, has to do with language, conversation, and dialogue. Now, for those of you who have taken a psychology class, you might have heard meta in the term metacognition, which is thinking about the thinking process. Meta writing would be writing about writing. So meta just kind of means, if it, not always this way, but a good way to start thinking about it is that when you say something's meta, it's X about X, where X is the same thing on both sides. And so people use this to refer to kind of reflection on the topic at hand, using the topic itself to do that reflection. Don't ask me why this is called meta. It has nothing to do with the meta that we are talking about. So now armed with this idea of X about X, metadiscourse is writing that tells us how we're supposed to be sort of experiencing the writing. It's kind of a signal or a signpost. So it's often used to establish things like common knowledge or a turn in thought. For example, adverbs like obviously or certainly or apparently. Phrases like in fact, as we know, we can assume that. In this way, the author of the text is kind of telling you that they recognize that you're reading this, and they're also recognizing that you share a common knowledge or a sense of understanding that makes their point valid in some way.
And that's it, guys. That's all there is to it. That's really all there is. Yeah, that's it.
You won't actually find something about metadiscourse, at least not that phrase in the Hacker. I have indicated places in that text that talk about signal phrases in terms of citation practices, which we'll talk more about later. Some of that would be considered metadiscourse, how we've talked about it, and some of that would just be conventions of academic language and using other people's words. Metadiscourse is actually from a very nice woman named Martha Coln. If you're interested in learning more about what she has said, I would be happy to copy some of her work for you.
You know, I've never met a pun I didn't like. You're welcome.